Thank you so much for joining us today for our newest LPI webinar. Through its many initiatives, LPI aims to raise awareness and empower those who would like to volunteer their time in the service of preserving languages worldwide. One of the most important aspects of language activism is connecting with the public and communicating the significance represented by each and every language in our world today. The LPI webinar series hopes to educate LPI's audience by hosting a dialogue between artists, activists, and academics who are focused on the importance of language diversity. I'd like to thank Planet Word Museum and WikiTongues for co-sponsoring this event with LPI. Planet Word's mission to engage the public with the power of language is inspiring and innovative. WikiTongues empowers its thousands of members worldwide by providing access to digital tools to catalog, upload, and publicize their own oral histories in their native tongues. I'm so honored to welcome world-renowned artist Rafael Lozano-Hemmer to discuss his inspiration for the Speaking Willow installation on view at the Planet Word Museum and how he uses technology to connect viewers by bringing language to life. Rafael is a Mexican-Canadian media artist working at the intersection of architecture and performance art. He creates platforms for public participation using technologies such as robotic lights, digital fountains, computerized surveillance, media walls, and telematic networks. He was the first artist to represent Mexico at the Venice Biennale with an exhibition at Palazzo Benaxel in 2007, and his works have been exhibited at biennales, public art spaces, and most of the major museums and art institutions around the world. He has received numerous awards, including 2 BAFTA British Academy Awards for Interactive Art in London, an Artist of the Year Rave Award from Wired Magazine, a Rockefeller Fellowship, and the Governor General's Award in Canada. Lozano-Hemmer's work truly engages the viewer as it explores the possibilities of human connection. His pieces have established lines of visual and audio communication across national borders and transformed voices into pulses of life. In his reflection on language for Planet Word Museum, Lozano-Hemmer designed a tree whose branches, made from hollow aluminum, house Ethernet cables that end in visually stunning speakers which detect movement under their swaying boughs. As visitors walk beneath the 20-foot interactive sculpture's willow-like canopy, these speakers light up and play sayings, poems, and songs from almost 400 languages. The effect is transformative and personal, as if each language is being spoken confidently into the ear of the listener. The artwork was commissioned in partnership with Planet Word Museum and Public Art Fund, and the language samples were originally recorded and published by WikiTongues and the Endangered Language Alliance. Rafael, I'm going to start with some questions that I thought would be interesting to the group, and then we'll open this up for questions from the audience. A quick word to the audience as we talk, please feel free to submit questions by clicking the Q&A button. So the first question is, when you were approached with this commission, what inspired you about Planet Word?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this. I'm excited to be here and talk about my project, Speaking Willow. I had never heard of a museum of language, so I was fascinated by the idea of highlighting a fundamental part of our identity, community, our humanity, our shared humanity. And I actually come from a family actually of nightclub owners, but there's also a couple of writers in my family. Octavio Paz, a Mexican poet, was a cousin of my dad's, and though I only met him about 5 times, he influenced me greatly. He believed very much in the importance of translation. The daunting task of translating poems was something that he believed in very fervently, because he believed that you could never do justice to the poem, but you still had to make an attempt to get similar effects with your own language. And so I am originally a Spanish speaker. I speak English in my daily life and with my family, but I'm also in Quebec, where I'm learning French. And I think that there is something really beautiful about being able to speak several languages and crucially to sort of find different types of yourself in each one of the languages. I think that when I speak Spanish, I'm a completely different person than when I speak French or English. So it was a great opportunity to make language material. And this was something that actually has been in my work for a long time. I think that when Planet Word and Public Art Fund approached me, they knew about my interest in making the invisible visible. How do we see language? How do we make it material? And Speaking Willow is really the culmination of this desire that I've wanted to create artworks that in a way show the diversity or are kind of iconic or indexical of how fragile and diverse the human languages are.
Amazing, thank you. As someone who's passionate about the possibilities offered by technology to celebrate and reinvigorate languages, I love your use of features such as 3D motion sensitive cameras and LED lights. Can you give us some insight into your thought process behind combining technology with art to highlight hundreds of different languages?
Yeah, so I mean, the artwork is meant to be biomimetic, right? Like we're trying to replace a real tree that used to be in this entrance with a tree sculpture that is kind of living because there's vine and ivy that's growing on it. So it is kind of like a hybrid object that that somehow needs to be reactive to the public and be able to whisper into their ears the sound of over 300, almost 400 languages from the world. So what might be useful, if it's okay with you, I'll just share my screen for a minute so that people who haven't seen the piece know what we're talking about. So this is, one moment. So this is the original design for the piece. So as you said, it's an aluminum structure that branches out using the idea of the tree as a sort of branching out, but sharing the same kind of trunk and connectivity, which is humanity, let's say. And from it hang these bells, which are polycarbonate shells that act as resonant chambers to a tiny loudspeaker that is underneath these bells. And the loudspeaker also has the LED lights. So what happens is as you approach the Speaking Willow tree, the computer knows that you're coming close to it and lights up the bells that are directly on top of you. And they start reproducing the language that is on top of your head. So these people, for example, this is at the very beginning. So my understanding is that the greenery has grown, but you can see how as people stand underneath the tree has stories to tell. So I think that probably in this call, we're all fascinated by different initiatives like Wikitongues or Living Tongues or Endangered Language Alliance. I mean, we're all concerned over, how to document and how to keep alive these languages. But in this case, it's not so much an archival, sort of didactic process as much as it is just as a sensual sort of insinuated kind of whispers from the tree. So this is what we want to do, is we want the tree to be quiet until you walk around it, and it is in the walk that you start hearing the voices of all of the different recordings. So we're trying to animate the Wikitongue recordings with having this kind of architectural or biomimetic presence. And the artwork is one thing to note is that when you're outside of it, it actually stops playing languages, but it goes into tree songs. So we have, into bird songs. We have, I believe, hundreds of recordings from the Cornell ornithology library. So now you hear a different kind of language. But when people walk underneath it, what they hear is this Wikitongue recordings. So the lights allow us to see which is the bell that has been activated. I like that it's kind of like the firefly. The language of the firefly is these little sequences of glimmering light that sometimes get synchronized. So they're kind of like fireflies. But more importantly for me, it's just like a really straight direction so that you can see which speakers are playing back. If you're patient and you walk under the piece, you may, and we have this a lot, people are trying to listen to see if they can recognize the languages, find their language, and sometimes stand underneath it to be washed by the memory of that recording.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. Many of your artworks discuss the possibilities of human communication and connection. Although you have not specifically emphasized endangered languages in your work, can you speak to the importance or impact of bringing language preservation into a public space?
Yeah, I mean, it's really an artwork about a very important subject, in my opinion, in the sense that we know about the fragility of these languages. I was very troubled, mortified to learn that 50% of the 7,000 languages in the world are fragile. They're on their way to extinction, and that you know, that loss is a very significant loss. Like I was saying, it's on the one hand, the creation of community, you know, the idea of shared experience, which is a big deal in my work, is we share experience through the shared languages that we have. But the other possibility, or the other thing that concerns me, is not just the loss of community, but it's the loss of possibility of thinking differently, right? So as I was saying, I'm a very different person when I speak Spanish language than when I speak English. And I'm curious, well, what would I be if I were to speak one of the languages that is now disappearing? And I think that this is a phenomenon that is, of course, not just language, it's also biodiversity, is like ancestral, you know, communities. I mean, it's almost as if we are at a moment of homogenization and globalization, which, you know, has some really bad parts. One of the bad parts of globalization is the atmosphere wants to kill us. It sent a COVID virus to infect us all, and we are all now, you know, sort of reacting to the very same thing. At the same time, this globalization with homogenization can also have a positive part. Like, for example, I'm thinking of languages where you've had like diasporas, like the United States, Washington, D.C. famously has hundreds of languages right in the immigrations that are there. Globalization tools may allow us through diasporas to re-engage with those languages, those original languages, and create communities at a distance, which is something that is significant. So I'm not really moralizing. I'm just, like everybody else, concerned over the disappearance of these languages. And my contribution in Speaking Willow is just to make them seem as something that's ephemeral, something that is a whisper, something that invites you to be curious about the non-mainstream languages and alternative, you know, ways of thinking and ways of being.
Thank you. Interactivity seems key to the exhibit. How did you plan to engage the public, and what was your process in considering the best means to do so?
So I've long said that my artwork is inexistent, does not exist without the public. So my works are incomplete. There are often platforms for people to participate. So many times I have artworks that have microphones where people need to talk. I have sensors that let the artwork detect where the person is. Sometimes I measure people's heartbeats. I mean, it's a wide variety of different interactive artworks. I find that interactivity creates a sense of intimacy, and this is important. The intimacy, if I show people, you know, just like a video with 400 different languages, it's unlikely that they might actually go through them, because the process of browsing through it is very linear. You don't feel kind of immersed in it. By using this kind of tree and the idea of of walking underneath it, you know, like the idea of walking and listening, I thought was an important sort of element in it. I wanted to embody that sound. I want to share with you a story that I've told many times before, so apologies to whoever's heard this before. But in 1837, Charles Babbage, the inventor of the very first computer, mechanical calculator, first the difference engine, then the analytical engine, which famously was programmed by Ada Lovelace, the first software programmer. Charles Babbage wrote in a book called the Ninth Bridgewater Treatise that when we speak, we create a turbulence in the air. And then he wondered, what would happen if we have a computer that is so sophisticated that we could rewind the motion of all the molecules of air and recreate all the voices who have spoken in the past? So for Charles Babbage, the atmosphere was a vast library that contained all the words that had ever been spoken. And he wonders, who could we hear? Well, we could hear love, lost ones. You could hear, for example, the voices of extinct languages. You could even find evidence of wrongdoing. In a beautiful passage of this treatise, Babbage talks about how slave owners are getting away with murder, but that all their deeds are being recorded by the atmosphere. And one day we would use that as evidence to send them back to justice. And so this idea that the atmosphere is pregnant with all of these sounds of the past is something that I like to evoke when thinking about a project like Speaking Willow, because it's really about making a body, confronting this space that is neutral and we don't think about much, which is the atmosphere, and make it have this, this association to echoes from the past. And I think that that's, let's say, the poetry of the project comes not from precisely what is said from each language, but how can we evoke the sense of our presence, our action, having a reaction and a trigger to hear the echoes from this recorded past. So interactivity is meant to do that, to not be like a spectacle and something that pushes you away, but something that invites you in and that, you know, invites you to promenade, to walk underneath the canopy.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. That's something that I never considered before. How has this project's focus on linguistic diversity influenced your own reflections on communication?
Oftentimes we hear that art is about communication, and I cannot disagree more. Art is not about communication. Art is about communion. Not communion in a religious way, though it could be also a religious way, but communion in the sense of sharing, of complicity, of having a mutual experience that we can talk about. And communication is a different word. Communication is about being able to efficiently communicate something from one point to the other. I think we're doing great in, without art to communicate with each other. So for me, what's important in this kind of work is to have a reasonable realization of fragility and the importance that this fragility has, right? Like, how do we, again, make tangible these languages, and just to be presented with the wonder that is, for example, mental plasticity, like the idea that, you know, our brains can communicate with each other by using this incredible plethora of different means and rules. It speaks to us about consensus and about community dynamics, family, and so on. And so I think that losing that is losing humanity. At the same time, I'm not one of those people who, for example, thinks of language as a massive domination problem. So when a guy called Nebrija, who is the first person to write a grammar for a Latin language, for the Spanish language, he wrote this book just at the time when the Spaniards were conquering America. And he in the prologue, he writes that language is companion of empire. So the process of colonization is really the process of spreading a language, but equally important and much more brutally, it's also the elimination of other languages, right? So these languages like Spanish, like English, like Mandarin, they arrive, like French, they take over in a colonial project and they decimate the diversity that was there before. But nowadays, for example, with respect to English, to me, it's fascinating that more English speakers are actually speaking it as a second tongue. So, the chances, if you say, hey, well, this person is an English speaker, chances are statistically that the person's from Portugal or from Mozambique or from Mexico, because so many people speak it. So I like the idea that that colonial part is now being sort of taken over by the colonized, and now language does not just belong to the English colonial system. It becomes something that we can all appreciate, so long as it's happening simultaneously with the respect and maintenance and usage of other languages, right? So I think that the future is polylingual, and the sooner that we come to terms with that, we realize that English is not necessarily English, or Spanish or French or Mandarin are not threats. They're just, affordances.
Thank you. This is just a reminder to the attendees that you can feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A. So next question is, part of what is so meaningful about Speaking Willow is your decision to include samples from around 400 languages. How did you choose the ones to feature? What did you take into consideration when selecting a particular sample?
So there was a desire, especially initially, to be demographically correct. In other words, we wanted to ensure that the 400 languages that were on the tree were representative of the maximum number of speakers in the world. My understanding is that these 400 languages that were chosen represent almost 98% of the world's population. So I wanted, in a way, to use these common languages because I wanted the possibility that someone who speaks a language that shows up in Washington, D.C. may find this language. So that was one consideration. The idea of the intimacy of the connection to your ancestral language. The second thing that we did is, to be honest, we went through the quality of the recording. So a lot of the material that is in Wikitongues, for example, is completely fascinating. You have these very beautiful sort of recordings. Some are extremely done with very low quality means, but they're valuable. We try and ensure that whatever we're putting in Speaking Willow is legible, that you can really hear it well, that it doesn't have a lot of interference. And then the third criterion was, of course, the content. So the content that we were looking for was about language itself. So it wasn't so much about, cultural condition. Well, actually, cultural conditions, yes, but not about, I don't know, like the economy or politics or something like that. It was about the language and about tenses and gender and all of the different sort of dynamics of the language itself. So those things were thought about. And in the end, to be honest, I see Speaking Willow as a starting point. I don't think it's never pretending to be an exhaustive representation. And that is really important to underline, because of course those languages all of them are still alive and they are changing. And that I believe that change is something that's natural and something that we all want to happen. So it's a snapshot. It's very specifically chosen for their acoustic, geographical, and content qualities.
Thank you. I love the beauty of the willow tree swaying branches. What was your thought process behind selecting a tree as the model for this sound sculpture, and why a willow tree?
Right. So, I mean, the tree has forever been used in taxonomies, not just of languages, but of species. And I think that it's a really good one, right? It gives us this idea of, to an extent, a shared origin. And even if that's not the case, many languages were completely, grown out of separate stems. The tree gives us that sense of a shared planet, and then it opens up into branches. Originally, I wanted each of those branches to be, oh, okay, well, this is going to go into language families and so on. But I mean, that work is very, very difficult, in part because a lot of the languages that we wanted to represent it would make a tree that was not balanced. I wanted it to be like as much as possible biomimetic to the weeping willow. The weeping willow, why that? Well, a couple of reasons. One of them is because it's native to the area, so I thought this is important. I really like the gravitas that it has. I think that there is something about it that grounds the project. It's almost as if the trunk then grows this massive hanging branches that almost touch the floor, as if it wanted to return like an Ouroboros. And then, frankly, because ultimately I needed a tree that at the end of it would have like straight sort of hanging branches to hang my speaking bells. So, and then, of course, the fortunate coincidence of the names Speaking Willow as a game on Weeping Willow. But yeah, I mean, the idea of working with the imagery of the tree, I thought also made sense for the location where it was at, where, like I said, there used to be a tree, and I wanted to make sure that we kind of signaled and respected that tree that left.
Thank you. The speakers seem to emit sounds at the volume of a whisper. What was the significance of this volume choice? What environment did you want to create?
Right. So for me, the approach for this work is very much like the Charles Babbage story that I was saying, right? The idea that the atmosphere is full of these languages and that somehow we can tune in on one of them, for example. So this is the opposite of like a clear single speaker, right? There's a composer, Frederick Chesky, who sadly just died, who talked about the loudspeaker as this fascist element, right? Like there's a whole history of fascism and loudspeakers and this kind of monologue, that is one way and so on. So the idea is not to have a single speaker, but is to have hundreds of speakers and have that diversity be always played back quietly and kind of in a way in concert with each other. It's almost as if the whole tree is a choir. And for me, the word cacophony in English is ridiculous because we talk about it as if there's only one cacophony. But I've made a lot of works with hundreds of speakers and different channels of sound. And we notice that the cacophonies are actually universes that you can sort of walk through, and there's this kind of sense of tuning, our capacity to single out one sound. So it had to be quiet to avoid the sense of the speaker as fascist monolith. It had to be quiet to bring people in as opposed to push them away. And it also had to be quiet so that in concert, what emerged from all of these different languages playing back is something that, would add to our experience. It would create, as an experiment, it would create a song.
Thank you. Thinking specifically of Border Tuner and Remote Pulse, your work often builds visual and audio connections. How do you see yourself contributing to this project of connection through Speaking Willow?
So this composer I was just speaking about, Frederick Chesky, he always said that the most important goal of art is to bring people to come together. So even though it sounds quite a hippie idea, I really believe more than ever that this is exactly what art should be doing. It's an opportunity for a shared experience. And I think that most of my works are about that. How do we not consume content or get content that asks us to watch it, by ourselves, but how do we share that with others? And then how does that become part of, of ourselves? And I recognize there's other ways to work, but this is my specialty. My specialty is in thinking about a public plaza, or in the case of work that you're mentioning across the US-Mexico border, how do you take that border or that plaza, not as a place for separation and organization of people, but as a place of assembly? And so I think, especially after social distancing, more than ever, we need to take over our streets, our museums, our borders, and be present and share, because it sounds a little bit naive, but I believe that this is the, I don't know, the source of a more vibrant democratic representation of the diversity that we are made out of, right? Our bodies in space. This cannot be denied. So yeah, I think the Speaking Willow, of course, it's not a piece where people talk in border tuner. You would speak in order to be able to tune in a person on the other side of the border. It's a project about talking and listening. And Speaking Willow is more like a walk. I think of it more as as a way to engage the body in the process of listening.
Thank you so much, Rafael. That was so interesting. So I'd like to now open the discussion to questions from the audience. I'll begin with some that I've received throughout the course of the talk, and we'll try to address as many as we can. So if you have any questions to the audience, again, please put them in the Q&A function. So the first question is a question that I also have, which is, I would like to know a little bit more about how the Speaking Willow works on a technical level, if possible.
For sure. So this is an artwork that is made out of these speakers. Let me show you. I happen to have it right here. So this is the Speaking Willow loudspeaker. So the reason why we can do hundreds of sound channels is because this is in fact an MP3 player. So what we did is we have hundreds of these tiny micro SD cards, each of which has a different language in it. And what we do then is we don't have to send a signal to from the computer to the loudspeaker, the actual sound. Instead, all the computer does is it sends power. Well, the transformer sends power, but the computer sends a signal to start and stop, to change volume, to change the actual track that is playing. And so one of these would say, for example, be English or Spanish or whatever it is, and it would always stay with that language. When no one was participating and we would trigger the bird sounds, each of these speakers also had a different species of birds so that we could also trigger that. And then what we did is we got this custom made so that it's waterproof, and also so that it would have this ring of LED lights. And then this is all surrounded by silicone, and then basically like a silicone mold. And then on top of that is the polycarbonate bell. Then that's connected by Ethernet cable. It goes, every single one of those goes Ethernet cable all the way downstairs, where in the basement we have this massive patch bay with 400 channels of sound connected to a computer. I want to mention that all of the engineering for this project was made by my studio here in Montreal. So the head of R&D, Stefan Schultz, did the hardware. Then Caroline Record, who is a programmer from the DC area, which is really great. She lives here in Montreal, but she's from DC. She did the software and the tracking. And finally, Rebecca Murdoch, the industrial designer, she designed the sculpture together with Kite Kim, an architect. So Oh yeah. So to mention another thing that's important, the tracking is done with what's called structured light sensors, which is basically like this little infrared sensors that shoot infrared and scan the area almost like radar, and then tell the computer if someone's standing there. And then when someone goes there, the computer knows it and triggers the right lights and speakers to start playing back. So that's the whole part of it.
That's very impressive. Thank you. So another question we have from the audience is, can you explain your choice to use samples of many different languages in isolation?
So, I mean, we had to choose languages based on availability, right? First, we tried to reach out to speakers. I had originally thought that the best usage of speaking Willow was a mode in which everybody, all 400 languages, were saying the same thing. And this same thing could have been something as simple as a description of the language, or it could have been a kind of declaration of the fragility of languages, something like that. I thought that dramatically and conceptually that would work. But then it was clear there is no world in which, you know, a small team such as ours could reach out to do all of this. So Public Art Fund, the curators of the project, got in touch with WikiTongues. We had heard the WikiTongues and we understood that this was under Commons license. And then we decided to use WikiTongues recordings only because A, they are existing, B, many of them are extremely good quality, and then C, the project would not be this kind of obsessive like curation of individual languages that we had access to in Montreal, which, you know, it doesn't really mean much when you're in DC, have a completely different language profile, or more importantly, really understand the planetary scale that Planet Word tries to do. So then we went with WikiTongues as a solution to find them. And again, they were chosen on the issue of number of people who spoke them, on the issue of the quality of the recording, and on the issue of the actual content being specifically about language itself. That's how we did it.
Thank you. The next question we have is, do you see technology as a largely inclusive or divisive force?
I see technology as a language. And as a language, it's not a tool that is optional that we can just move on away from. I believe that the latest numbers in North America speak of about 8 hours a day per person we stand in front of a screen, be it TV, internet, or phone. So if the people are watching 8 hours of screen time a day, it is impossible, as McLuhan would say, to imagine what it would be like to not have those 8 hours. So technology is a part of us. And as such, to work with technology is something that I don't think of as original or new, is something that I think of as normal, as natural even, because to study technology is to study ourselves. So I reject ideas of technology as a tool. And I also reject ideas of technology as inherently a good or bad thing. Now, having said that, I also don't think that technology is neutral. Technology is imbued already with all of our prejudices. For example, computer vision is one example of many that I can give you, where there is a bias and a racism that is already inscribed into the technology itself. So as we work with technologies, say the internet, we have to, be mindful of the fact that the internet was developed in the 60s by the Pentagon for control and communications in the battlefield. So how do we take technology, which oftentimes, as I say, has this kind of dark past, and we create poetic or critical experiences that, may help us move forward. So I think of it as a language itself is the language of globalization, and I use it because it's inevitable.
You mentioned that technology is a language, and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the questions are, do you see art as a language of its own? If so, what is the grammar of your art?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about art is that it's really difficult to define, right? Like, what is art is the question that will never have an answer, because the moment that we define it, some artist will come out and say, well, no, now this is art. And I think that needs to be fostered and welcomed, because art is experimentation. Art is trying to work with the unknown and try to come up with forms or strategies or approaches or sounds that to a degree represent, you know, an artist's state in the world. And I think that for me, there's a lot of talk about the language that is developed by an artist. And though I think that there is some truth to that, you know, it's impossible to turn around and say, well, let's think of who are the artists who have developed a really unique language. So you think of, say, Jackson Pollock or Picasso or somebody like that. But all of these guys, usually white men, have actually swiped enormous amount of previous existing art that, you know, may come from Africa in the case of Picasso. It may come from, you know, all sorts of different phenomena. So I rather like to think about art as certain continuities or progressions in experimentation that has already been happened before. So I like artists who challenge the repeatability of their so-called language. And I think that though there are some threads that are common in my language, in my artistic practice, I like to undermine the expectations of that too, because I don't want to be stuck sort of repeating the same thing over and over again. And to the degree that I fail to not repeat things over and over again, that's my language.
Thank you. How do you think art builds connections across cultures or space? Do you think art has the potential to encourage mutual respect?
Yeah, absolutely. So a pretty good example of that is Border Tuner. If you don't mind, I want to share my screen for a moment just to show people a couple of artworks that are successful in doing that. So let me go here and open. Sorry about that. Open this. Sorry. So this is an artwork across the US-Mexico border that happened in November of 2019. And it's basically a piece where people can connect across the US-Mexico border using powerful searchlights that cross the US-Mexico border. So let me just show you. You have a little knob. It looks like this. As you turn the knob, the powerful searchlights penetrate the airspace of the other city. And when you finally find somebody on the other side, it opens a bidirectional channel of communication between the two sides. And they can hear you and you can hear them. If you don't like what they're saying, you can tune them out. So over the period of a couple of weeks, every night, tens of thousands of people showed up to speak to each other across the US-Mexico border. Because El Paso and Juarez, El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Chihuahua are sister cities, there's a lot of connections that are already happening ethnically, historically, politically, environmentally across this border. And the piece became like this massive concentration of serenades and concerts and people talking to each other. This is a very kind of clear way in which you know, the border can be animated. And, you know, a lot of people across the US-Mexico border, of course, are divided families. It was a very intense and beautiful connection. And again, it's in this case, the languages were English and Spanish, but we also had, for example, Inde communities and Raramuri and other indigenous cultures speak through it. And so that was nice to not see it as a bilingual region, but a polylingual region. So this is a Border Tuner. And it was, it was a really intense project.
Okay, the next question is, were any of the languages particularly emotional for you?
Yeah, I mean, especially so I'm originally from Mexico and I live in Canada. And because of my distance to Mexico, I romanticize and I idealize my country of origin. So being able to hear some of the languages of Mexico was very emotional, especially because not as much as is happening here in Canada or maybe happening in the US. In Mexico, I'm not seeing enough of a resurgence of the idea of reparations and addressing basically the genocide of pre-Columbian cultures, indigenous cultures. A lot of people in Mexico say, well, there's still a lot of indigenous people and we're all mestizos, we're all mixed race and so on. And yet the dominance of the Spanish language in a country that has another 300 languages is problematic. Mexico, I think at the turn of the 2000s, actually signed or changed the constitution to say that indigenous languages would be respected. But as you may know, here in Canada, for example, we had actually fully, operative residential schools that, their entire job was for indigenous communities to not be able to speak their languages and be, how do you say in English, assimilated into English or French, and that's devastating. And I think that that's changing around the world. I think that Mexico is also changing. That I think there's being more and more interest and respect of indigenous communities and their languages. But if I have to choose some that was touching, it was definitely those.
Thank you. I think this would be a good time for you to discuss what you have sharing on the screen.
Sure. So we have, I wanted to show a couple of examples of other language projects that we've been doing at my studio. So for the longest time, like Babbage described, as we speak, we create these banderoles, these volutes of language. And I was very interested to think about, well, exactly what is the shape of this language? And so we worked with NYU, Auburn University, and Georgia Tech with a system of laser tomography to actually measure the density of the air as you speak. In Spanish, we call it hálito. That's the air that is ejected from your mouth as you're speaking. And then what we did is we took slices of the density of a particular word, and we created this video that you see here that shows you actually, well, what is the density of the air? Because of course, it's different temperature than the atmospheric temperature. So this is the shape that we found. And then we used a thing called photogrammetry to create a 3D model of this ejection. And then of course we 3D printed it. So this is the world's first 3D printed speech bubble. And I really like the shape. I thought that it was incredible that a word was the size of your hand. It's almost like a projectile. Then what we did is we actually printed a full sentence, which is this one. It's the sentence says, au clair de la lune. And the reason we chose Au clair de la lune as the first 3D printed speech is because a fellow called de Martinville, about 20 years before Edison recorded with his phonograph the first human voice, de Martinville recorded his voice with soot and wax. And now we can listen to what this very first human recording was, and it was him saying Au clair de la lune. So that's what we decided to print. And then we're doing sculptures like these. What's interesting to me about the shape of these sculptures is that the same person saying the exact same thing will generate a completely different air turbulence. So, and this is time, right? So on the right is your hand. So au clair de la lune, from left to right, you can read it that way. And then, of course, we're making big versions of this work. So this is a massive work that we're putting in the National Gallery of Canada, which is with the words of Armour Schaefer, listen to the world. Another example is this. This is
every atom impressed with good and with ill retains at once the motions which philosophers...
Very interested in how the words are actually ejected from our throats and the vocal folds. I worked with 6 actors in England to read the text from Charles Babbage, and this is what you're seeing. Inside of all of us is this beautiful orchid that actually takes our air, which is private, and brings it into the public for others to breathe. And this is how we resonate in the air. So some people don't like this image, but I really find it fascinating. Or this example, which is an artwork made by the 2 women who also worked on Speaking Willow. This is a cloud display.
Nation.
So Caroline there said the word nation, and then this word appears on the display. Rebecca's in the back, and it creates the words using cold water vapor, so that whatever you say just sort of appears and then disappears after a little bit. So again, like, how do we make artworks that make tangible language, and that it gives us a sense of this kind of breathing language? And then that's what I wanted to show you from other artworks apart from Border Tuner, where we've used materialization of language.
Those are amazing. Thank you so much. Sadly, we only have time for one more question, which is going to be, what are you working on now?
So many things, but one of the things that we're excited about is a project called Atmospheric Memory. And it's entirely based on that passage that I told you about, the Ninth Bridgewater Treatise from Charles Babbage. So we've made a full immersive artwork that has 20 different experiences and machines that try to extract sound from the atmosphere. One of them is that cloud display that you just saw. Another one is the endoscopic film, but we have 20 of those. And then we make them into a timed entry immersive show where we try and recreate the reality that Babbage imagined, the reality that nothing is ever forgotten. And that project is going to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. It will be there starting on the 1st of December, and then it's going to tour. It's going to go to Houston. It's going to come to Montreal. It's going to go elsewhere. But I'm excited about it because it's kind of a theatrical, let's say, presentation of 20 artworks, which normally they're all by themselves, but this time they form like a dramatic narrative around the idea of the atmosphere trying to tell us something.
Amazing. I think we have a little bit more time. I have a question, which is, how long did the Speaking Willow take you to make?
So it probably took about a year. I should mention that the fabrication of the sculpture itself was made by UAP, which is a really great fabricator out of Australia, but also in New York and other places. Their part was just as difficult as our part. When I say our part, is more the electronics and the archive and the triggering, but their part, for example, called for, you know, extremely non-symmetrical sort of elements to be assembled into a tree-looking device with very specific perforations. And so if you're interested in this and the sort of tech side of this, they actually used this augmented reality glasses to be able to, as you see the tree with these glasses, you can see the labels of where the languages go into each orifice. And that was super important when you're fishing 400 wires through it to know which language is which. So a lot of the development was spent, you know, just trying to make it possible. But our job was to make it so that when you approached it in DC, you just go, oh, okay, well, this tree speaks when you're underneath, and that's all. But yeah, the development took over a year.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Raphael, for taking the time to speak to us today, to our co-sponsors for their support, and to our audience for joining us. For more information on the issues and artworks discussed today, I'd like to invite the audience to visit LPI's website at www.languagepreservationinitiative.com and to check out Planet Word Museum and Wikitongue's online presence and social media. Thank you so much again, everyone, and Raphael for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.